July 3rd, 1943. The phrase, "I lived to tell the tale," is something often said in relief of having had a close brush with death. But when death has become your everyday and your friends, your family, your loved ones are the ones whose death you survive, that phrase takes on a greater meaning. The survival of their memory now depends on that you have lived to tell their tales. Some of this week's tales are of resistance fighters who sacrificed their mind and body for humanity, and of ordinary young men unwillingly given the onerous of surviving for remembrance. Before we start today's program, here's a word from the Time Ghost Army.
Never forget. Never give up. Never surrender. Join the Time Ghost Army.
This is War Against Humanity, a series of World War II in real time. I'm Spartacus, Olsson. Last week we saw Reichsführer SS Heinrich Himmler order the final liquidation of the Jewish ghettos. The French resistance took a huge hit as its leader, Jean Moulin, and many more of the leadership were captured. The Battle of the Ruhr continued with new raids on Krefeld, Mülheim, and Wuppertal, killing dozens and displacing thousands. This week, that continues, and yet another record is broken. Sorties are flown at urban areas in Naples, Sicily, and Greece, but the focus of the air war remains on Germany. On June 28th, a fleet of 608 aircraft, including 267 Lancaster and 169 Halifax bombers, makes its way to Cologne. Despite cloud cover and poor target market drops, it becomes the most destructive raid of the war so far. Almost the entire city is turned into rubble, with 24 schools, 16 churches, 7 post offices, 2 hospitals, and 2 theaters reported to be completely destroyed. 230,000 people are homeless, launching a refugee stream into the surrounding area. It is also the deadliest single bombing event in history so far. The casualty rate is 10 times of what was considered average when the Battle of the Ruhr began this spring, with 10,000 injured and 4,377 reported killed. Charred bodies of men, women, and children buried under their houses and littering the streets. Some 7,000 kilometers to the southeast from Cologne in Bengal, British India, it is not bombs that continue to bring death, but hunger. The food drive of the last weeks has effectively robbed many already destitute rural inhabitants of their last resorts to feed themselves. The scenes remind one local newspaper of similar events back in 1770, when a third of Bengal died in a famine caused by the East India Company, which paid the cultivators whatever trifling price they saw fit to pay, and took away all the crops and hoarded them jealously. And if they sold any back, they sold it back at 10 times what they bought it for. Whatever arrived by boat from other provinces, they snatched that up too, while the starving cultivators sold off even their seed crop to survive. Things have not quite come to that yet in 1943, and in an attempt to avoid total disaster, on July 2nd, Bengal Governor John Herbert sends a letter to Viceroy Lithlingo, who is serving out his term until Archie Wavell will take office in October later this year. I'm sorry to have to trouble you with so dismal a picture, but Bengal is rapidly approaching starvation. The situation could only be described as alarming. Unless we can get in food grains on something like the scale originally promised, the law and order situation will get out of hand. Lithlingo's response is not to promise succor, but a message of congratulations to Governor Herbert for the success of the food drive, adding that the seized volume shows how much rice was in fact available. This cold, disinterested attitude of the colonial powers is what is driving some Indians, like nationalist leader Subhash Chandra Bose, to actively pursue help from Britain's Axis enemies to gain independence.
India and Japan have in the past been bound by deep cultural ties which are about 20 centuries old. In recent times, these cultural relations have been interrupted because of the British domination of India. It is, however, certain that when India is free, these relations will be revived and will be destiny. In this connection, I should add that the statements made by Premier General Tojo on India since March 1942 and repeated by him before the Imperial Diet on the 16th June 1943 have made a profound impression on India and have greatly helped the Indian independence movement.
If a report that comes out in Japan this week is to be taken at face value, seeking help from them is probably a futile endeavor. On July 1st, a government report called An Investigation of Global Policy with the Yamato Race's Nucleus, completed by the Ministry of Health and Welfare, is published. It draws from the 19th century imperialist and nationalist literature on eugenics, racial pseudoscience, as well as from more modern Nazi theories on race. In essence, it takes the fictitious concept of an Aryan master race and transposes that on the idea of a superior Yamato race destined to rule the rest of Asia. It's just as unfounded as the theory of the Aryans, but similarly builds on a mythical national origin story that has been growing in popularity since the turn of the century 1900. The Yamatos are traditionally the people of the Yamato region, where the Imperial House of Japan originated in the 4th century. Now, the Yamatos have been expanded to include all native Japanese and to retroactively include anyone that purportedly originated on the Japanese islands and later settled regions along the Pacific. Not only is it nonsense, it's such a blatant reproduction of Nazi race theory that it addresses the Jewish question and its perceived impact on the racial purity and strength of a people, even though the Jewish population in Japan is all but non-existent. It tries to bridge the Japanese idea of a greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere by reaffirming that all Asians are equal and should live amongst each other free of any Western imperialist rule, but the Japanese, or rather Yamato, are the most equal of the Asian peoples and are destined to rule them all. The impact of the report is doubtful. As we have seen, the ideas it describes are already being implemented in the occupied territories, and processes to impose Japanese names, language, and religion on minorities in the colonies of the empire, like Korea, have been underway for at least 2 decades. What it does is to spell out clearly what has so far been obfuscated in policy text and never spoken of publicly. Back in Europe, it is in a completely different setting that some are not speaking. In Lyon Gestapo Chief Klaus Barbie torture chambers, the resistance leaders around Jean Moulin seized last week are still refusing to cooperate with their captors, despite intimidation, threats, and torture. Destrin's Chief of Staff, Henri Aubry, describes how his tormentors try to force intel out of him. At noon, I was again taken to Montluc prison, where I was put up against a wall. After I was chained to it, 4 soldiers came in, stood in front of me, and on the order of my interrogator, who, after making it clear to me that since I would not give up the steering committee's box, I was going to die, commanded his 4 men in German, aim and then fire. After that first volley of shots, which surrounded me on all sides, the interrogator said, in response to my astonishment and finding myself alive, "The first time was for fun, now it's for keeps. Will you say where the steering committee's box is?" When I again replied that I did not know, they proceeded to repeat that horrible comedy 4 times. After the 4th volley, I was knocked unconscious by an extremely violent blow with a rifle butt. When the torture becomes unbearable, some of the resistance operatives don't yield real information, but concoct fabrications close enough to reality for them to remember in repetition, even when beaten semi-unconscious. But nonsense enough to have no bearing. Raymond Aubrac, the leader of Libération Sud, will later conclude that Barbie, contrary to his reputation, was not a clever cop, just a relentless brute. It was not sophisticated torture, just brutal. He had whips and billy clubs and 2x4s. He beat me a lot, and there was nothing intellectual about his methods. He just asked the same questions over and over and over again. When Bobby works out who Jean Moulin really is, he becomes the victim of the worst possible treatment. Aubrac will later testify that I saw him 2 days later out of my peephole. He was going down the stairs, but really he was being carried down. He had been beaten terribly. He was all bruises. A leg was sort of trailing behind him. He had been very nearly destroyed. But Moulin, who knows everything, says nothing. And on June 28th, after a week of futile torture, Bobby gives up and Moulin is transferred to Paris, where he is again tortured, again says nothing, and now remains captive in a Gestapo cell as the week ends. While the Nazis might not be successful in this atrocious endeavor, they are terribly successful at genocide. Steps are now taken to finish the wholesale deportation and extermination of the Jewish populations of Western and Central Europe. On the 1st, SS Obersturmbannführer Adolf Eichmann, in charge of the transportation of Jews to occupied Poland and murder, is granted full authority by head of the Nazi Party Chancellery and private secretary of the Führer, Martin Bormann, to use the Gestapo to eliminate the Jews from the territories of Greater Germany. Until now, the SS has had to do most of their own dirty work, and although in effect only a delay of the inevitable, Jews could appeal deportation to the Gestapo on certain grounds. Eichmann can now overrule any such measure and simply use the Gestapo as he sees fit and seize whoever the SS believe to be Jewish with prejudice and without process and ship them to one of the many concentration and labor camps or to Auschwitz-Birkenau, Sobibor, and Treblinka, where they will be killed on arrival. It has immediate effect, like when Gestapo officer Heinz Röttke, in charge of the deportation of French Jews, is anticipating an influx of Jews as a law of stripping them of their nationality is expected to be passed by the Vichy collaborationist government. To preempt any hesitation or even opposition by French police, who have so far been in charge of rounding people up, Röttke decides that the Gestapo will run operations by themselves. He requests help from Eichmann, who sends him a special commando and his, quote, best lieutenant, Captain Alois Brunner, who arranged the deportation of 43,000 Thessaloniki Jews back in the spring. It is no coincidence that these decisions fall the same week that the newest installation in the extermination factories becomes operational. On June 28th, SS Major Karl Bischoff reports in Berlin that 4 new crematoria are now operational at Birkenau in the Auschwitz camp complex. Crematorium is a euphemism for a gas chamber system. The first 2 gassing houses at Auschwitz, the Red and White House and Crematorium 1, have long become too inefficient for the murder rates they aspire to. Moreover, with the rising numbers of bodies to dispose of, Camp Commandant Rudolf Höss has gradually increased efficiency to dispose of the bodies from burial to bonfires to immediate cremation in ovens. The 4 new facilities, numbered crematoria 2 through 5, are industrial death machines. They consist of unrobing stations that lead to gas chambers that open on the other side to a holding room with corpse elevators that lead directly to cremation ovens. The old Crematorium 1 at Auschwitz I was capable of murdering and disposing of 340 human beings per day. Crematoria 2 and 3 have 5 ovens each and can process 1,440 corpses per crematorium per day. Crematoria 4 and 5 have 1 large 8-muffle oven each and can burn up to 768 corpses per day. In total, the crematoria now have the capacity to murder and dispose of 4,756 every day. At that rate, Auschwitz-Birkenau can process 1.7 million murders per year. The crematoria are staffed by fellow prisoners working in the Sonderkommando. They too are part of Höss' efficiency plan. Originally, different groups of prisoners were forced to do separate parts of the preparation for murder, collection of personal belongings, and the disposal of bodies. Last year, Höss integrated them all into multitasking labor detachments. None of the members of the Sonderkommando are volunteers. None of them knew what awaited them when singled out for this job. All of them will at some point or the other face the horror of dealing with the murders of friends, relatives, and close family members, even their own children. Almost none of them will survive, but sooner or later become victims themselves. As the process begins, they try their best to reassure the victims. They have no choice. The very few survivors will recount the horror they feel when they are forced to coerce fellow human beings to humiliate themselves by taking off the last suit of armor, their clothes, and stand naked in a mass of strangers. They will recount how they struggled with following the strict orders by the SS to not reveal what is about to happen, and yet not to lie and give the victims a moment of dignity and awareness of their impending fate. They try to avoid direct interaction, even eye contact, but often it's unavoidable. Like when one 18-year-old girl confides to one of the men that she is a virgin, and she breaks down in tears as she has just realized that she will die without ever having known the intimacy of physical love. In such instances of potentially panicking victims, the Sonderkommando men have two choices as ordered by the SS. Calm the victim down promptly, or separate them so that they can be taken away and murdered alone by neck shot. Then they have to get the victims into the gas chambers. When the door closes, an SS man uses a compartment chute from the outside to drop into the chamber Cyclone B hydrogen cyanide tabs that promptly evaporate into a deadly gas, suffocating the victims by depriving the body cells of oxygen in a process that can take several excruciatingly painful minutes. When the last victim is dead, the chamber is opened on the other side, and the Sonderkommando is again forced to work. One of the men mostly tasked with this part of the job and who will survive is Jakob Silberberg. When they opened the doors, we saw a tangled mass of people who'd been suffocated. Little children at the bottom, adults above them, fat people below. Everyone had wanted to be on top in order to breathe. It was terrible. The people had become swollen, black, and entangled because of the way they'd suffocated in there. It was hard to untangle them in order to take them to the furnaces. They were warm, blue, black, and swollen. They no longer had faces at all. They'd become a pile. They weren't people anymore. We had to remove these people from the gas chamber and bring them to the room where the bodies were kept. We tied them by the leg and dragged them out by a leg or an arm. There, they divided them into groups, women on one side, men on the other, children on the third side. Now they have to clean the gas chambers from body fluids. Then they have to shave the corpse's head hair, check the bodies for valuables like gold teeth and jewelry, remove it, and move the dead victims up to the ovens where their colleagues, the stokers, burn them. The stokers are the only ones never put on multiple tasks. The work is too heavy and too gruesome for anyone but a few. Silberberg will account for what he sees at the ovens. When we opened the door of the oven, we saw the fire and the body forms. The bones of the people started to sway from the heat as if they were beginning to live, as if they were arising from the dead. The bones changed character. If you bury a person who has died, he doesn't feel a thing. In the oven, it is as if he feels something because of the fire and the heat. The form changes. It is not like a log. It starts to make movements. Despite living in what the phrase hell on earth fails to even remotely describe, surprisingly few of the Sonderkommando men commit suicide, although they often contemplate it. Those who live will explain how the visceral hope to survive another day, to not die no matter what horrors you face, is a factor. But one other factor is perhaps more important: to live to tell the tales of the dead. One man, Philipp Müller, moved by the serenity of the victims as they become aware of their fate, but calmly begin to recite the Jewish national anthem, the Hatikva, the hope, decides to join his people in death and begins to unrobe himself. A woman stops him, saying, "So you want to die? But this is senseless. Your death won't give us back our lives. That's no way. You must get out of here alive. You must bear witness to our suffering and to the injustice done to us. Never forget."